Today we're going to take a look at state and local governments and the impact that they have on the overall scope of government. I once had a professor who said that the heart of all government is at state and local governments. And what he meant by this is probably state and local governments are more likely to affect your life than the national government, and yet we know very little bit about the state and local governments. For example, you could probably all name the national leader, the president. Maybe some of you by this point in time after class can name your representatives in the National Senate or the National House of Representatives. But if I asked you to name your state and local representatives, my guess is you have no idea. And that is sort of the fault of the system for not really teaching you the people who are most likely to affect your lives. At the end of the day, if you don't like the roads in front of your house, the president isn't going to do anything about it. National Congress isn't going to do anything about it. It's really up to state and local governments to fix. And so most of what would actually affect your life is affected by state and local governments, yet they are the most neglected part of our governmental system. So if we take a look at our goals for today, number one, to explain federalism and the various sources of power within a federal system. So how do states get their power? How do local governments get their power? And then, of course, how does the national government get their power? To explain the duties of state and local governments. So what is it that the state and local governments we speak of do? And then to explain the major sources of income and spending at each level of government. So where does the money come from and what do they do with the money once they have it? So we start out with the government F word. Yes, federalism. And we know that federalism is the idea of shared powers, the idea that there are some things that states can do, there are some things that national governments can do, and there are some things that are shared between state and national government. By now, we've already taken a look at the pyramid of governments. We said there is one national government, 50 state governments, over 3,000 county governments, over 35,000 city and town governments, and over 48,878 special purpose districts. So things like water control boards, school boards, community colleges, these all fit into the sphere of special purpose districts, and they are government systems that we have. So we've already looked at the chart of federalism. I'm not going to go over this in a lot of detail. We know that there are delegated powers, those powers that only the national government has. Those are express powers, those that are directly written in the Constitution, implied powers, those that aren't directly written, but if we want to carry out an express power, we have to do them. And there are inherent powers. Just because we're a nation, there are some things that we have the right to do. So that brings us to the everything else. Everything else we know is a reserve power. It is a power that is reserved for the state. And that's mainly what we're going to focus on today, are these powers that are reserved for the state level government. So anything not listed in the Constitution, according to the 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, says that states have the right to control those things. We also know there are concurrent powers, things that the state and national government can do, and there are denied powers, things that neither level of government can do. So I always like this cartoon. It says, yes, no seatbelt laws. I'm in my car and I'm still a free man. And yet it talks about some of the federal and state speed limits. It talks about rules for the road, which are controlled by the federal and state government. So yes, there are different layers of government that affect your daily life, including driving a motor vehicle. So when we look at where does this power come from, where do state and local governments get their power from? It comes from the 10th Amendment. Of course, the Reserve Powers Clause says that anything that is not listed in the Constitution is given to the states. We know that in recent years, the national government has been increasingly taking more and more power away from the states. Technically, they can't officially do that, but they've kind of crossed into the sphere of what the states do. And there are a couple reasons for this. Federal government is taking control of things that otherwise should be controlled by the states because of, number one, the Necessary and Proper Clause. We know that the Elastic Clause says that Congress can do things that is not listed in the Constitution as long as it's to do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out the orders of the government, to carry out the things that the government does have the right to do within the Constitution. And so one of the ways that the national government, the federal government, has kind of expanded its power is by using the Interstate Commerce Clause, We know that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution says that Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce, that is, trade that happens between two separate states, and pretty much almost anything that you can think of in some way or another will relate to interstate commerce. So it may be a very, very thin tie, but they find a way to make it work. So, for example, the national government gets involved in schools because of the Commerce Clause, because you could potentially buy or sell something across state lines, including education itself. That falls under the jurisdiction of the national government. Technically, we know that it should be the power of the state and local government, but because national governments are expending their power, because they are giving even more power, they take it using the Commerce Clause. So we know that the Constitution of the United States of America is the supreme law of the land. We know that there are no rules above the national Constitution, but every state has the right to write their own Constitution. And so with the exception of the national Constitution, state laws and local laws all fall under the state Constitution. The state Constitution is the supreme law of the land other than the national Constitution within each state. And then any powers that are given to local level governments or other government districts come from the state level constitution. Technically speaking, if a state didn't want a city to exist, they would, under the national constitution, have the right to take it away. All local government is only created by state level governments. So some things that are done at the state government. This is, of course, not an extensive list. It's not everything, but some of the things that state governments do. They conduct elections. They establish local courts. So we know that Article 3 of the Constitution only establishes the Supreme Court. It's up to state governments to come up with local courts and state courts, of course. Intra-state commerce, that is trade within the state. Education is a major state power. Public works, so things like police, fire department, roads, those are all controlled by the state government. Taxes is one of those concurrent powers, so income tax and sales tax is mainly controlled by the state level government. States have the right to regulate marriage and pretty much anything else that requires a license. So to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be a dentist, to be a nail salon person, you name it, if you need a license for it, the state usually controls that. And so that takes us to our three branches of government. So why are we looking at things? We know that there are three branches of government. We know that Article 1 sets up what does it set up? You guessed it, the legislative branch. Article 2 sets up, the executive branch. And Article 3, you guessed it, the judicial branch. So all these things are set up by the national government. Now, the only reason why I bring this up is because state level governments aren't all that much different. There is a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch at the state and local levels as well. Sometimes they have different names, sometimes they've got the same names. Essentially, they serve the same purposes. So that system of separation of powers, it not only exists at the national level, but at the local level as well. So within every state government, there is a legislative branch to make the laws. So the state of Michigan has their own Senate and their own House of Representatives, and they pass laws for the state of Michigan. Then we have a state executive branch. What's the name of the chief executive? You guessed it, the governor, followed by the lieutenant governor. At the local level, that would be a mayor or a township supervisor. And then, of course, there are local court systems. So just like we've got a national court system, we've got local court systems to interpret the laws as well. So local courts and state courts set up by the state court system. So when we look at the legislative process, how a bill becomes a law, how we get our laws, the process at the state level is pretty similar to what takes place at the national level. We won't get into all the nitty-gritty details of it, but understand that it has to pass the State House of Representatives, it has to pass the State Senate, and then, of course, you guessed it, it has to be approved by the governor. The governor must approve any legislation. So just like the national system, we've got to go through the House and the Senate before the executive branch approves. Checks and balances. Now, one unique thing about the state-level government is that the governor has the power to invoke what is known as a line item veto. Now, this doesn't happen in every state, but Michigan is one of them that has the line item veto. And what that means is the governor doesn't have to approve an entire bill. The governor could go through a bill and strike out the individual things that he or she doesn't like and still sign a bill. So we know at the national level it's an all or nothing deal, and if you don't like it, you have to rewrite the entire bill and have it go through the House and Senate again. The governor has a unique power in the state of Michigan, and some other states, not every state, but some states have them, where they can implement what is known as a line item veto. They can cross out certain parts of a bill while passing a majority of it. This is pretty controversial because some would say that it gives the governor too much legislative power, but whether we like it or not, it still is something that is part of the Michigan Constitution. So speaking of governor, the qualifications to be governor in some cases similar to president, in other cases different. In Michigan, you must be a 4-year resident to become the governor. You must be at least 30 years old. And this is the tricky part, and I won't make you memorize this for a test, but you must not be convicted of a felony involving dishonesty, deceit, fraud, or a breach of the public trust if the conviction were related to the person's official capacity while holding any elective office or position of employment in local, state, or federal government. So, in other words, as long as you don't break the law at the felony level with something that involves your job as a public official, you're pretty much okay to run for governor. So the big qualifications: 30 years old, 4-year resident of the state of Michigan. The governor, of course, is the chief executive of Michigan. The governor's term, you guessed it, similar to the president, 4 years. And term limits on the governor in Michigan, you guessed it, it's 8 years. 2 term limits, so an 8-year total. So very similar to what we see at the national level. Now let's shift our attention to local governments, so things that are done at the local level. So probably one of the greatest things at the local level that will affect your life is land use and zoning. The way that zoning works is it tells you what you can do with your property, what you can build on a particular piece of property, and how you can build it. We'll take a look at some zoning regulations in a minute, but on with other powers. Just like the state level government, local governments control public safety, so things like police department, fire department, water department, those types of things. Local government is responsible for what we would generally call public works. The big ones being building codes, so how do you make your building safe? For example, in this classroom, you can only have so many people before it becomes a fire hazard. There are certain materials that you must use when building. For example, if you're going to put a plug near a water faucet, it must have GFCI protection in it. Other examples, traffic laws are set by the local government, and how you get rid of your garbage is set by the local government. For example, where my cottage is, there is no garbage pickup. So if you want to get rid of your garbage, you have to pay a private company to do that. In most communities, like Plymouth and Canton, garbage disposal is covered by the local government, paid for by the local government. Local governments have the right to tax. Most of the ways that local governments get their money is through property taxes and real estate taxes. We won't get into the details of that too much right now. Understand that's how they get their money. So an ordinance. An ordinance is just a fancy way of saying a local law. So at the national level, we call them laws. At the state level, we either call them a law or a state statute. And at the local level, we call it an ordinance or a law. So, for example, in Canton, there is a curfew. I think you got to be in by, 10 o'clock? That is a local law. That is an ordinance. Anytime you see no smoking within 10 feet of a building, that's a local law. That's an ordinance. You must walk your dog on a leash. That is an ordinance. Some of the crazier ones in Canton are maybe actually pretty legit ones. Your grass can be no taller than a certain height, or if it snows, you must clear the snow from your yard within 24 hours. Well, from public sidewalks in front of your yard within 24 hours. Another big one, if you have a pool, you have to have a fence. There's all kinds of ordinances. They're fascinating. You should really check them out. So back to that issue that we were talking about when we said zoning. Zoning is a way of planning out a city. It would be very, very frustrating if you bought a piece of property and then somebody built a giant factory next door to you. Or if you bought a piece of property and somebody builds, I don't know, maybe you don't want to live next to a school and they build a school next to you. So the idea of zoning is to make sure that no areas get overcrowded, that no areas get polluted, and that you know what's going to be built around you. One example, my uncle bought a place in Westland 20, 30 years ago, and when he bought the place, his backyard was a nice little forest. And unfortunately, my uncle didn't check the zoning, and eventually somebody bought the nice little forest, they tore it down, and they built houses. And so my uncle was pretty ticked off when a big subdivision went up in his backyard. But really, honestly, if he had checked the zoning ordinances, if he had seen what the plan was for the land behind him, he would have known what was going to happen to his property anyways. And so if we take a look at the chart on the right, shows you the zoning ordinances of what the township of Canton looks like. Now, generally, when we look at zoning, we can divide things up into three basic options: residential, commercial, and industrial. Those are further broken up into more categories, but residential, where people live; commercial are like shops and businesses; and industry is like factories or places where stuff is manufactured. So those are the big part of zoning ordinances. There are even zoning ordinances for what you can do with your own property. So for example, how tall a building can be, or how far from a road it has to be built. For example, in the community where my cottage is located, your house must be at least 50 feet from the lake, 10 feet from any existing structure, 6 feet from the neighbor's property, and all kinds of other crazy things. 15 feet from the road. How do I know this? I put a shed up and, well, they called me out on it because I violated the zoning ordinances. So I had to move my shed. If you go to Washington, D.C., go on the close-up trip, you will notice inside the District of Columbia, inside the city of D.C. itself, that no building is taller than the Washington Monument, because there's a law that says no building can be taller than the Washington Monument. So if we take a look at zoning, this is how Canton is zoned. Again, it's basically residential, industrial, and commercial, but then that gets divided up even more. And so if we zoom in, we can see a chunk of land where you've got PCP, and then located around it we've got medium density housing, we've got low density housing, very low density housing. But basically, you know, if you bought a house in this area, you know that there's going to be a school or a community center put up there. You can see the bright blue, which shows you there might be some light commercial, some shopping areas there. And this is just so you know what you're going to get. If any of you live by IKEA, you'll know that before that it became IKEA, it was Super K, and before it became Super K, it was a nice little wooded area that provided some shelter, and it was very nice and quiet. And when they went in to put in IKEA, there were a lot of neighbors who had property bordering where, well, the Super K was before the IKEA was there, and they weren't happy because they said, well, I bought this land and I want this woods to be in my backyard. Now all of a sudden you're building a shopping center. I don't want that. Well, again, you probably should have checked the zoning plan to find out that that was zoned for commercial use. Had you known that, then you would have bought the property in the first place probably, and you wouldn't get so mad when they build the Super K and eventually turn it into IKEA. Here's another example of a map. This one is Superior Township, which is not too far from here. Probably any of you play the video game SimCity. SimCity is a game where basically you are doing zoning ordinances. You are building a city based on zoning needs. So go back, pull out your old Super Nintendo, and you can enjoy SimCity. You can play City Zoner. This is Becker County. You can see the same idea of what happens. The next thing we're going to talk about, we're going to go through kind of quickly because we've already talked about it in the elections unit, and that is the idea of direct democracy, initiative, referendum, and recall. I just want to review these things because they do happen only at the state and local level, and not every state or local government allows for them, but many do, including the state of Michigan, so we'll go over them. So the first thing, if you'll recall, is what is known as an initiative. And an initiative is a law that is proposed by a private citizen. Private citizen, you have an idea for a law, you take it to your congressman, they decide that they don't want to get it passed, well, you still have some recourse. So you can go out and collect signatures. You're going to propose the law, you're going to get a bunch of signatures. In the state of Michigan, it's 8 to 10% of the vote for governors in the previous gubernatorial election. Generally speaking, about 300 to 350,000 signatures. You get that many signatures, we say that your law is a good enough idea to put it on the ballot. So we will put it on a ballot, and then you get to vote. And then once you vote, they will decide if it becomes a law or not. So giving people the idea of direct democracy. These were ideas that came about during the Progressive era. Similar to an initiative is a referendum. Sometimes when Congress wants to write a law, but they don't want to actually vote on it because it's controversial, say something like increasing taxes, you could have a referendum. So what that means is that the members of Congress will write the law, the legislative branch at the state or local level will write the law, and then they will put it on the ballot, and they will allow the citizens to vote on it. And if the citizens vote yes, it becomes a law. If they vote no, then it is not a law. And so that happened a couple years ago when it came to raising taxes for improving the roads. Congress didn't want to raise taxes. I mean, they wanted to, but they didn't want to get blamed for it. So they said, well, let the people vote on it. And the people voted and said they didn't want their taxes raised. The third one is a recall election. The idea of a recall is if a state or local government in some way is not doing a good job, if they're corrupt, they're so bad we need to get rid of them early, we could have a recall election. So similar to an initiative, you need to collect a whole bunch of signatures on a ballot, and then once you get those signatures, we have a recall election. Basically, people vote not on who they're going to elect or not elect, they're going to vote on should this person keep their job. Should the current mayor keep his job, or should this current representative keep her job? It's up to the citizens to vote on that. And probably, again, the most famous recall, you know it, the recall of Gray Davis in California, which eventually led to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor, becoming the governor of California. On to money. The most important part, maybe for many of you, is where does money come from? So if we look at major sources of revenue, where do different levels of government get their money from? These are not the only places, but these are the major places. The national government gets most of its money from federal income taxes. So whether that's personal income or business income, national government gets its money from income taxes. State government has tons of sources of funding, but the two big ones, state income taxes. So when you have a job, you make money. Some of that is going to go for state taxes. And then also state sales tax. You know, whenever you buy something in Michigan, you pay 6% sales tax on it. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, you're paying 6%. That is how the state government gets money. And then local governments usually get money from what is known as property taxes. So based on the value of your home, they decide how much taxes you're going to pay. So we can see revenues come in, they go to the state and local governments, and you can see what state and local governments generally spend the money on. So first of all, federal taxes, federal revenue. We know that most of the federal money, most of the national money comes from individual income tax, national income tax. A good chunk of the money also comes from payroll, or what is known as social insurance taxes, to pay for things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Some money comes from corporate income taxes, a little tiny bit from excise taxes. That'd be like a tax on parking or booze or cigarettes or something like that, maybe even the consumption of gasoline. Some money comes from tariffs, some money comes from gift and estate taxes, and then of course there are other sources of funding. The big one that you need to know is that most money comes from income taxes. Now, how is the national government spending your money? 21% on Social Securities and pensions, 17% on national defense, which is down from the 1950s. In the 1950s, it was about 50%. Medicare and Medicaid, so those social insurances, about 24-25% of the spending. Transfer payments, so what you would probably call unemployment and welfare insurance, Those things account for 13% of national funding. We're paying almost 10% interest on the national debt, so when we borrow money, we have to pay interest. That's a big chunk of our federal spending. That number only goes up and up every year, so that could end up being a major problem one day down the line. And then, of course, there are a bunch of other things we spend the government money on, but mostly on entitlement programs, things that people are entitled to. One of the big things, if we want to look at the difference between a debt and a deficit, we looked at that huge amount of interest we're paying. A deficit means that you are spending more money than you are collecting. So you owe money. If you owe money at the end of the year, that is what is known as a deficit. And the debt, or the national debt, is if you add up all our deficits from year to year to year, you get the debt or the national debt. So that number keeps on rising. When I started teaching, there was a video called 10 trillion and counting, because the national debt at the time was $10 trillion. Now that we're about 11 years into my career, I think the number is about 18 trillion, 19 trillion these days. Do a Google search for debt clock and you can find it. But anyways, the amount of money we owe is going up over the years. State taxes. The state government has the right to tax as well, and states get most of their money from sales tax. So we know that state income tax is also a big way they get their money, but state sales tax, when you buy pretty much anything other than food, and even some food can be taxed. We won't get into the details, but whenever you buy something, you pay that 6% tax. That's where states get most of their money. They also get some from individual income tax, corporate income tax. Same chart that we looked at before, we'll look at again, this time for state governments, mostly sales and excise taxes, some from personal income taxes, and other from corporate taxes. Again, if you want to know the big one, the number one source of state funding, state sales and excise taxes. This is a look at my paycheck from 1 month. You can see the first three things tell you federal taxes that I've paid. The next one is the state of Michigan tax that I pay, and the rest are retirements and investments and stuff like that. So again, giving you an idea of state and local government and where the money comes from. This is a chart from your book. State money, how do we spend it? Number one, on education. Education is the biggest source of state funding. We also spend money on public welfare. Again, we talked about things like police, public safety, all that kind of jazz. Health and hospitals is a small portion. Highways probably should be more in Michigan, but it's not. Public safety, followed by other sources. So again, the big one you'll need to know, money spent on education, biggest part of state spending. And again, from your book, they break down the numbers a little bit differently, but same general idea. Finally, local taxes. Where do local governments get their money from? Property taxes. So your property has a value associated with it. The more your property is worth, the more you pay in taxes. And this is what is known as a millage or a mill. Anytime you hear a vote to increase the millage, it means a vote to increase the amount of taxes you have. So the way a millage would work is if you own a house that is valued at $100,000 and you have 1 mil, you're paying 1% of the value of your home, and we won't get into the complicated formulas of how they cut that number in half and that number in half, but just understand a millage means a proportion of your tax, a percentage of your tax, which means a portion of your taxes is going to be collected through the value of your property. So again, if we want to look at the chart, primary revenue, 73% of local government money comes from property taxes, the rest from sales and excise taxes, and there are a few other smaller taxes in there, but that's the general breakdown. How do local governments spend money? If you said on education, you are correct. 44% of spending on education, 12% on welfare, hospitals, and healthcare, 11% on public safety, 8% on parks, housing, and sewers, 5% on the roads, and 20% on other. So again, state level government spending most of their money on education. So that gives you a good overview of the heart of government, state and local governments. Take a state and local government class in college when you get there. Honestly, most of the government, most of your life is impacted by what state and local governments do. So Have a wonderful day, and we'll be back soon.